The Bible is a book most people think they know. They've heard the highlights: Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, the Ten Commandments, Jesus on the cross. But if you actually sit down and read it cover to cover, you start running into passages that nobody quotes on Sunday morning. Verses that get skipped over in sermons, left out of children's Bible storybooks, and conveniently forgotten when people talk about the Bible as a perfect moral guide. Today, we're going to look at some of these surprising verses and think about what they tell us about the book, the people who wrote it, and the claims that get made about it. Let's start with something basic. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 give two different accounts of how humans were created. In Genesis 1, God creates animals first, then creates man and woman together at the same time as the final act of creation. In Genesis 2, the order is different. Man is created first, then animals, and then woman is made from the man's rib, because none of the animals turned out to be a suitable companion. These aren't just stylistic differences. The order of events is different. The method is different. If you read these back to back without any preconceptions, you'd assume you're reading two different creation stories that got placed next to each other. And that's actually what most scholars think happened. These come from different sources that were later combined. This matters because it tells us something about how the Bible was put together. It wasn't dictated word for word by a single author. It's a compilation, edited and stitched together over centuries, with the seams still showing, if you know where to look. Now let's talk about a verse that surprises a lot of people. Deuteronomy 20, where God gives instructions for warfare. When the Israelites conquer a city, the men are to be killed, but the women, children, livestock, and everything else can be taken as plunder. For certain nearby cities, though, the instructions are even more extreme. Kill everyone, don't leave anything alive. This isn't a one-off. It shows up again in Numbers 31, where, after a battle with the Midianites, Moses gets angry that the soldiers kept the women and children alive, and he orders them to kill every male child and every woman who isn't a virgin, while keeping the virgin girls for themselves. These aren't metaphorical passages or poetic exaggerations. They're presented as direct commands, attributed to God, given through Moses, as historical instructions for how to treat conquered populations. If a modern person read these words out loud, without saying where they came from, most people would immediately recognize them as a description of war crimes. The fact that they're in a religious text doesn't change what they're describing. Here's another one that catches people off guard. Leviticus 25 talks about slavery, and it makes a distinction. If you're an Israelite and you fall into debt, you can be sold into a kind of indentured servitude. But there are limits. You have to be released after a certain number of years. But if you buy a slave from the nations around you, from foreigners, those slaves can be held permanently, and you can pass them down to your children as inherited property forever. This is in the same chapter that talks about the year of Jubilee, which gets a lot of positive attention because it includes debt forgiveness. But right alongside that, there's a permanent hereditary slavery system for non-Israelites, explicitly endorsed. Exodus 21 goes even further, giving rules for how hard a slave owner can beat a slave. As long as the slave doesn't die immediately, the owner faces no punishment, because, as the text says, the slave is the owner's property. These passages were actually used by defenders of slavery in the 1800s in America to argue that slavery couldn't be morally wrong, because the Bible regulates it rather than condemning it. And if you read these chapters, it's hard to argue they're misreading the text. Let's move to something a little different. A verse that's less about violence and more about how the Bible treats women. In Numbers 5, there's a procedure for a husband who suspects his wife of cheating on him. He brings her to a priest, who makes her drink a mixture of water and dust from the floor of the tabernacle, after putting a curse on it. If she's guilty, the text says her body will physically suffer. There's actual language about her abdomen swelling and her reproductive organs being affected. If she's innocent, nothing happens to her. Notice what's missing here. There's no equivalent ritual for a husband suspected of cheating by his wife. The entire ritual exists because of male suspicion, and only the woman's body is on trial. This is presented as a legitimate religious procedure given by God to Moses for the priests to carry out. It's basically a trial by ordeal, the kind of thing we associate with medieval witch trials, except it's in the Torah, treated as divine law. Now here's one that a lot of people, including a lot of Christians, have never actually noticed. 2 Kings 2. The prophet Elisha is walking along the road, and a group of boys comes out of a town and starts mocking him for being bald. Elisha curses them in the name of the Lord, and then 2 bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of these boys. The text doesn't say they were killed for any moral failing beyond making fun of a bald guy. It's presented almost casually as evidence of Elisha's prophetic power. If you imagine this scene as a movie, a holy man cursing a group of kids for teasing him, and then bears tearing them apart, it plays more like a horror movie than an inspirational story. And yet, it's right there, in a book that's read in churches every week, usually skipped over entirely. Let's talk about Jephthah in Judges 11. Jephthah makes a vow to God. If God gives him victory in battle, he'll sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever comes out of his house first to greet him when he returns. He wins the battle, comes home, and his daughter, his only child, comes out to celebrate with him. The text says Jephthah is devastated, but he goes through with the vow anyway. His daughter asks for 2 months to mourn the fact that she'll never marry, and then the text says he did to her what he had vowed. And that's it. The story moves on. There's no divine intervention to stop this, the way there is with Abraham and Isaac. There's no condemnation of Jephthah for making such a vow or for following through. In fact, Jephthah is later listed in the New Testament in Hebrews 11 as one of the heroes of faith. A man who killed his own daughter as a human sacrifice is held up, generations later, as an example of someone who pleased God. Here's a smaller one, but it's interesting because of how it gets used today. Leviticus 19:28 says not to make cuts in your body or tattoos. This verse gets quoted constantly by people arguing that tattoos are forbidden by the Bible. But that same chapter, just a few verses earlier and later, also prohibits wearing clothing made of 2 different materials mixed together, like cotton and polyester, and prohibits trimming the edges of your beard, and prohibits eating meat with blood still in it. Almost nobody who quotes the tattoo verse follows these other rules from the exact same paragraph. This raises an honest question. If these verses were all given together, in the same context, as part of the same set of instructions, what's the actual principle being used to decide which ones still apply today and which ones don't? Usually, the answer has more to do with modern cultural preferences than with anything in the text itself. Let's look at something from the New Testament now, since people sometimes assume these problems are an Old Testament thing that Jesus fixed. In 1 Timothy 2, Paul writes that women should learn in silence and full submission, and that he doesn't permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. In 1 Corinthians 14, he says women should remain silent in churches, and if they have questions, they should ask their husbands at home. These aren't obscure verses. They've shaped centuries of church policy about whether women can be pastors, priests, or have leadership roles. Whatever you think about gender roles today, it's worth noticing that these instructions are presented as universal commands, not as advice limited to one specific situation in one specific city. Here's one more from the Gospels that surprises people. Matthew 10:34. Jesus says, "I have not come to bring peace, but a sword," and goes on to describe how he's come to set family members against each other, turning sons against fathers, daughters against mothers. This sits oddly next to the more familiar image of Jesus as someone who taught people to turn the other cheek and love their enemies. Both of these things are in the same book, attributed to the same person, sometimes just a few chapters apart. And finally, there's Psalm 137, a poem written by Jewish exiles in Babylon, mourning the destruction of Jerusalem. It's full of real, raw grief, and it ends with a blessing on whoever takes Babylonian babies and smashes them against rocks. This is one of the most emotionally honest pieces of writing in the whole Bible, because it doesn't pretend the author feels anything other than what they actually feel: rage and a desire for brutal revenge against people who hurt them, including their children. What do all these verses have in common? They were written by real people in real historical situations, reflecting the values, conflicts, and assumptions of their time. Read that way, the Bible becomes a fascinating historical document, a record of how ancient people understood war, gender, justice, and their gods. The surprising verses aren't flaws in the reading, they're windows into who actually wrote this book and when.